Yeah, and I photograph my work a lot whilst I'm making it as well, even at all different stages, decorating. Back from when I was talking, when I learned ceramics originally, we actually, as part of our coursework, used to have to make these things called making diaries, which you would literally photograph all the stages of making your work, and then you're annotating what you're doing.
Hi, I'm Bob Acton, host of the Color and Ceramics podcast. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome ceramic artist Jack Durling to the Color and Ceramics show. Based in Brighton, Jack has spent the past decade at Rose Hill Workshops, where he creates intricate, hand-built ceramic sculptures inspired by the natural world. His work beautifully blends delicate, decorative details with environmental storytelling, using lusters and textures to really captivate viewers. Jack's deep connection to wildlife began in childhood, spending time in Dungeness, and he continues today near the South Downs National Park. His artistry has been recognized by the Craft Council, exhibited in top UK galleries, and even featured in the Great Pottery Throwdown. He also teaches at West Dean College and now offers classes from his Brighton studio. Jack's passion extends beyond ceramics. His work supports conservation efforts, and he was shortlisted for the David Shepherd Wildlife Artist of the Year in 2022. His Shared Memories mural in Maidstone's Moat Park stands as a testament to his dedication to public art. And of course, I'm thrilled to have him on the show because I love his figurative animal work and his connection to conservation efforts worldwide.
Welcome to Color and Ceramics, the podcast for ceramic artists who want valuable ideas about using color from leading artists and world-class experts. Here's your host, Bob Acton, a sculptor and ceramic artist who's fascinated with color and how potters, sculptors, and artists use color in their work. Tune in as he talks with his guests about color, techniques, and the impact of color on people and art itself.
Jack, thanks so much for joining us today here on the Color and Ceramics podcast. I'm excited to have you on board with us here.
Well, thank you for having me, Bob. I'm really looking forward to taking part in this.
Oh yeah, it was great. Of course, I do a fair bit of sculptural work, and you do as well. So it was great to be able to connect with you and talk about how you do your work. And of course, I'm interested in color and surface design as well. And you've got some really unique ways of adding some pop and color to your work. And so I look forward to chatting about that in some more detail. Um, Hey, Jack, before we get going, I wonder if you could tell people a little bit about you and how you got to where you are today, like what your training was or where you learned what you did, that sort of a thing.
So I grew up in Maidstone in Kent, and um, I just went to a normal community school, but we had a really good pottery teacher, and it just really spoke to me. I was always quite creative because I'm quite dyslexic, so um, being more involved in those sort of subjects and that sort of, you know, direction, it just really spoke to me really. And academically, I wasn't as driven that way. And then, yeah, so when I went to secondary school, uh, I just we it was part of the curriculum, but then I was quite lucky to be able to do it as an A level as well, which is a bit unheard of these days. So I kind of learned all how to hand build and hollow forming techniques. So generally, we would normally create a sculpture from a slab base up and then coil from that point forward. And yeah, it was great. I loved it. Like I did really well actually with my A levels as well. I actually managed to do three art A levels and got the highest grades in my year group, which was amazing, really. And then I went to college at UCA, which used to be a complex in Maidstone, and the resources were a bit more limited. So I think I became a bit more resourceful with looking at other materials. and then you just go on a journey, I guess. And then I looked for different courses because I wanted to further my education at uni, and then Brighton. I kind of did it all on paper, and I looked at all sorts of places. I looked at Wolverhampton, which was specifically a ceramic course, and then ended up doing a 3D course at Brighton, which allowed me to also explore metals and plastics and wood as well. But I then specialised in ceramics and learnt more of the alchemy side of things, which is something that I'm really interested in as well as sculpting and ceramic. There's also so much with the alchemy and how get to your finished result of your work. Um,
So
so
you
learn.
better explain what alchemy means, because some
Oh
people
yeah.
might think you're conjuring up gold over there.
Oh no,
So
no, no.
so tell us a little bit about what you mean by
Yeah,
alchemy.
so I do. I talk about with ceramics, there is a lot of processes which are quite scientific. Like you use a lot of ratios when you're creating glaze. I still have my like diaries even from when I was at uni, and they're always something to look back on, and you never know how those different glaze recipes could come into play further down the line. And yeah, so that's what I mean by alchemy, really. And yeah, so I like to use a lot of different combinations of materials, such as using oxides and layering with slips, and then glaze techniques, and then ultimately lusters, which I'm actually self-taught in using those. We didn't cover it when I was at uni.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we'll talk a bit about that down the road here, because I love some of your luster work that you're doing. Um, now you are really focused on animals in terms of your work. What brought you to that? Like, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, something that I talk about quite often. So I'm one of four children, and like we didn't have like a lot growing up in a way. And my grandparents used to take me and my three siblings to Dungeness and New Romney like every October half term. So I mean, it was quite rough weather, you know. Um, but I loved it, and we used to go to places like Port Lympne, Howletts, and right in Dungeness as well as a bird sanctuary. And my granddad was always quite a twitcher and really interested in birds. We used to go to that bird sanctuary and like observe the wildlife there, and it's a really amazing place, and it's somewhere that I've always hold quite close to my heart. Even like these days, like as an adult, I go back, and every time I go back, it means a lot to me and my siblings and my family. So, and that's really where my interest in wildlife came from. Um, and then you'd see, I mean, the Aspinall Foundation, as it were, like they do actually do some really interesting projects and conservation out in the wild. So as becoming an adult, I actually became a bit conflicted about zoos and things like that. But equally, I think, it had a real effect on me with actually realizing like my interest with wildlife, but also at them becoming an adult, much more aware of how delicate that is, and what we as humans do wrong with wildlife. But equally, there are very positive stories as well. And then when I was at uni, the poaching crisis, particularly with rhino, really spiked. Um, and I just think they're just such incredible animals. And it's a project that I kind of started to look into. And I wanted to kind of discuss how rhino horn was worth its weight in gold. And that's actually how I started to work with lusters originally.
Ah, of course, of course. Yeah, that makes sense when you mention it.
And I have donated money from sales as well back to charities. And uh, I used to make work which was a bit more graphic, I guess. But now I have those sort of subtle reminders. But I now use lusters in a way which kind of signify certain narratives in my pieces and certain details, so accents as well. So it's not entirely hard hitting. I always think of my work as being quite a celebration of animal species and that interaction between them sometimes too. but then there are some sort of conservation themes in there as well. Yeah.
Hmm. Now, how do you pick what animals you want to make? Because, of course, there are a myriad of animals that we could work with. Um, what, and you mentioned the rhino, of course, but what's your method? What's your strategy about how you pick the animals that you work with?
For a lot of species that I look at, I quite often have some sort of fascination towards them. There's something that captures my imagination in a way. Um, like it could be, particularly again with endangered wildlife, that's something else that does come into play, those themes. But with like hares, for instance, I actually live up by the South Downs and I have observed them. And I do make British wildlife as well. And actually, when you start to dig beneath the surface, there's many species that are found on our doorstep that are equally, at risk from human activity. And they're really hard to come by sometimes, hares in this country, to actually see them in the wild. But I did have a really magical moment last year teaching at Westdean, and I took my students for a walk up into the pine trim, like the arboretum at the back, and all the rhododendrons were out, and it was like dusk. And at that sort of time in the night, they're almost a bit luminous, like the purples. And then we just had a hare that just ran in the pine trim, like in front, just really magical. So yeah, so a lot of the animals I look at as well, like bears, for instance. Um, I think there's some sort of childhood sort of stories I think that come into play sometimes, and I guess they're quite cuddly for us growing up as kids, but equally, I just um, like polar bears, for instance, very much affected by climate change, and I just think they're really special. Like I just feel really connected to bears and other animals that I make, really. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me, because I think I hear you talking about having an emotional connection to the pieces or the animals that you choose to sculpt. And that comes from some of your childhood experiences and your adult experiences, but that there's always this emotional connection to the work itself.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking earlier today, I don't know really why this came into my head, but when I was growing up, um, there used to be like a gift shop in this garden centre which we used to go to, but it was kind of a slash gallery as well, and it was always quite special for like me and my siblings to go with my dad, sorry, to then go and choose like a piece for my mum for her birthday. So, it's those sort of things. And my nan was always a collector of Beatrix Potter sort of music boxes, and I was always like fascinated by those. And she's still got them actually, and I've been eyeing them up, thinking I'm definitely no. What you said, I'd love to have one, of course. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. So, so that's the first step for you in your work is to have that emotional connection with a piece, with an animal, and then that begins the process for you of beginning to make it. So, can you talk a little bit about how you make your work? What's your methods? What's your techniques that you use to make your sculptures?
Um, so particularly when it's a new species for me, like I would normally go about making a maquette, so like a small version of it, just to kind of get an understanding of how the limbs are, fall within that animal species, I guess, and uh, in terms of like their body structure as well. But I do illustrate a lot as well, and um, I don't. I talk about this on courses. I don't draw photorealistic and exact detail. It's more about capturing um, the actual essence of the animal and just body posture and um, the stance of them and things like that. And then I'll do combinations sometimes, and I will also I do an exercise for people on courses sometimes where I'll get them to think of a composition, and they'll have like 10 minutes, and by the you have like 1 minute per sketch, and it does actually really help to like loosen up your ideas. And I do work with some visual imagery as well, just because you can get a bit lost sometimes, I think, which and then you have that reference point. You might be like, oh, I don't know, for instance, how many toes they have. I've got a picture up here of a baker, for instance, just so I can, but I don't copy what I see. I'll show you here. Like, can you see these sort of sketches here?
Ah, yes. Yeah, I know what you mean for sure. Because you always have to reference back to a piece. In a way, it seems to me that one must always have the form correct in the sense that the shape, like if you're talking about a polar bear, for example, the polar bear must be looking like a polar bear. Then you can play around with the surface and the shape of it, but it still has to have that formed correctly to.
Yeah, so with the sculptural process, if I was to scale it up, for instance, I'd like to always get the general shape and silhouette of the animal, and then I'll work back into it once it's got to that stage. And they're always hollow formed, so combinations of slab and coiling. Um, and yeah, so I always think of it as three-dimensionally drawing, and particularly um, with like some of my animals as well, I'll leave sort of an open cavity, I guess, where the head would be, and I'll quite often then will coil that section and slow right down and sculpt back into it. And then obviously the actual full sculpture at that point could be manipulated and changed, moved to get the sort of form that I'm working towards in that posture.
Hmm. Hmm. Absolutely. And so that makes a lot of sense to me that you're working with images to try to get the form correct, and then you begin to play around with it in some context, right? Um, now, how do you play with color in respect to this? So you've got the form, and we'll talk a little bit about your materials you use in a second, but how do you begin to think about color? Because you do, aside from the gold, which you're using, you do add little pops of color on many of your pieces that are quite bright and bring the eye to that piece and that or that component of the piece.
Um, so I often use generally slip techniques, and then I actually pigment slip with materials, and then use them in a painterly fashion. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, color is an important part, and it's something that I feel like always in ceramics. It's always you're always learning, and it's always a material exploration, and particularly. I I do find doing smaller tests on like little tiles and things like that, you can then inform like a further body or collection of work. But I do some of it is intuitive as well, um, and it's just you kind of start to realize how different clay bodies work with like a particular slip, for instance, and um, I generally also use like oxide washes beneath those as well to add further depth as well. And you have to offer again, it comes through just trial and error as well. Um, but you kind of start to identify, how much of that you need to put on for it to be successful. Um, and it hasn't been unknown where I might need to refire a piece, but I kind of you there's times when you, again with the sculpting process, when you kind of need to kind of realize when to stop and not to overwork pieces. I like to be quite expressive and fluid, I guess, sometimes with my approach, not for pieces to become a bit too contrived. Yeah, finding that balance really.
Hmm.
Uh,
I,
again,
you were laughing about um, uh, applying bits and learning when you were talking there moments ago, and it made me think about me and my work because I use an oxide wash on mine, and sometimes the challenge is how much do you remove, how much do you leave on, and that's kind of the artistic piece because what comes out of the kiln is not necessarily what you see that goes in the kiln when you're using those kind of oxides.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, the carbonate versions, for instance, are not as strong. So I generally go towards those rather than full oxide because they can be quite harsh. And again, but it depends what you're making. Certain work, it's nice when that metallic element comes through, and it really does provide a real depth in the piece as well. And that's something that I do often want to get through. I like to retain a sort of raw energy and um yeah, kind of really do reference back to the fact that I've used particular materials in order to bring that out in the sculpture. Yeah. So that's when I was talking about with the alchemy. That's something that, when it works, it really excites me. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, that's there's a magical quality to that, isn't there?
Yeah.
When you think about what you put in the kiln and what you pull out of the kiln,
Yeah.
it's not always what you see is what you get.
Yeah, and I photograph my work a lot whilst I'm making it as well, even at all different stages, decorating. Back from when I was talking, when I learned ceramics originally, we actually, as part of our coursework, used to have to make these things called making diaries, which you would literally photograph uh, all the stages of making your work, and then you're annotating what you're doing. And I find even that today is really helpful because unless you're doing the same technique over and over again, it's inevitable that that sort of memory of that can slightly disappear. So it kind of have it recorded, yeah, and it's just makes sense really.
Hmm.
But
Those diaries sound like a really interesting thing that an artist could use to record what they're doing, to keep those memories in place, and also begin to speak to other further work that they would create some ideas that would generate some other new work.
yeah, I think very much so. And I just taught a course on Sunday, and I bleat on about it. I'm like, make sure you're photographing as you go along. But I think it is really important because you will be like, oh, okay, so that's how I managed to achieve that part within this sculpture. And like you say, that can be transferred into further projects or adapted into, if you're making a different species of animal, for instance. Yeah. So,
Hmm. What are you doing these days that's exciting you?
um, so at the moment, I'm continuing to explore large scale again. Um, so I do like to look at different scales in my work and but particularly I've got a couple of things coming up next year, which I do doodle a lot as well. And it's funny, like you come back to these ideas sometimes, but I've had a tapir which I've been working on for quite some time, which is now drying out. But I'm also one for not rushing things as well, so that sat wrapped up for quite some time. But I need to feel ready to kind of to work on it. If you see what I mean. So it's just if I'm not feeling it, then I won't always force myself to kind of carry on with it. It's and I find I could talk about this expression of fresh eyes, and it is very helpful to kind of take a bit of time out from a piece and then come back to it, and you'll see what you need to be working on.
Hmm.
And
I like
yeah,
that idea of fresh eyes.
yes, yeah, little expression that I think of. But yeah, no, I'm now seeing it as I'm glad I took the time on it, because it was a new species for me to kind of be working on that scale, and I feel like I've managed to resolve some of the things that I was finding slightly difficult, I guess, within it, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah, for sure. And you said you're making some large pieces. How large is large for you?
Well, um, so I mean, I would go up to the dimensions of my kiln really, and I actually, when I talked about A level, some of the largest work I made was even back then. Um, I made like this bus which was just managed to fit in the kiln, and that was like 82 centimeters tall, I think. Um, but yeah, around those sort of dimensions, I've got quite a large front loading chromatic kiln, and I've got another top loader as well. But I want to fill it right up, and I made a polar bear this year, like a bust, which was very large and it had a real presence, which I really enjoyed. I'm going to further explore that with other bears as well. Um, yes, so I'm excited to, and like bears again, like yeah, just they're so unique. I think that's the thing with all species, and when you start really looking at them, you really sort of see the how individual they are from one another with evolution, which is I find really fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. It's lovely to work with all the different species. It's a challenge, of course, because then you have to learn all of the anatomy and work with the piece to get it right. But I mean, the palette is almost I don't know what to say. It never ends, right? Because there's so many different species, and I've been interested in insects recently through some macro photography that I'm doing, and that opens up a massive world around sculptural things. If you wanted to get down into the small little creatures of the world.
Yeah, very much. I mean, they can be obviously overlooked sometimes, and I think, like you say, just when you start to look at those things, it can just inspire you. And you, the other, yeah. So when we discussed earlier about certain animals, but I do recall actually with bears again, I was looking at the bile industry originally, and that's where it all kind of came from. So that, again, it's not a very nice sort of subject matter, but I wanted to kind of make some sort of discussion or commentary on that, you know.
Yeah. Now, how does that play out for you in terms of using your pieces to begin a discussion around things like you talked about rhinos and the horn being gold, and that creates an opportunity to talk about those. How do you facilitate those conversations further in your community?
Uh, well, I do point reference to it sometimes, and I do discuss it. But equally, I think with art, I think it should always be down to interpretation. And again, with like I made quite a large rhino calf recently, which didn't have a full horn because they don't when they're young. It's only a hump and it grows very slowly. But then people would sometimes interpret that as being that it had its horn removed or that it's come off, you know, when it actually wasn't the case. It was a baby. But not everyone would interpret it in that way. So I do, you know, I allow people to kind of see what they want within the work. But I obviously have my inspirations that inform my ideas. And yeah, again, with the like my penguins and, you know, the formations on the ice. And have a very large one, which will be in an exhibition in Sunderland quite soon. Um, but again, I like the way the other aspect is just how penguins and other animals interact with one another. I find that energy really interesting and
Uh-huh.
exciting.
Yeah, yeah, very good. I know you're working with a number of associations in the UK where you donate some of your pieces to the association. And how do the associations that you work with use your work to facilitate those conversations around animal welfare and
Yeah.
biodiversity and so on?
Well, with so for instance, I worked with a charity called the Aldrich Foundation, and they ran a program where they would get an artist piece in the school, like in a primary school, and then they would talk about the artist's work, and then it would like inform whole discussions with those students, and then workshops as well. So yeah, so that was the Michael Aldrich Foundation, and yeah, that piece at the time again was a rhino, which was slightly more graphic actually. but it is interesting, like children are quite aware of like some of the, you know, um, what wildlife is encountering. And, I think the other reason why I'm really interested in wildlife is, it's very beneficial for humanity, for the whole of biodiversity to be thriving. It's not in our best interest for, um, wildlife not to be doing well, of course. So, um, yeah, and it's something that we should all think about really when we can, or, you know, just anything that it's like, I don't know, because I live in Brighton, and sometimes people have like barbecues on the beach and then don't pick up litter after themselves, and but there is a lot of they did a whole thing recently where they literally gathered it all together, and it was quite shocking, just from a day. But next to the sea, that can all just blow straight in, and it's quite devastating, obviously, for some wildlife. And
Absolutely. When it ends up in the sea, then we don't see it because it sinks to the bottom or floats in the middle, and then we don't notice it, we don't think about it, and therefore it doesn't matter, right? And so
yeah,
bringing that to people's attention is really, really,
mm,
really important.
yeah.
Of all of the pieces that you do, and you make a lot of different animals, which one catches people's interest the most?
Well, recently, I'm particularly this year, I've been exploring hippos further, and I've really like when we've been just talking about color. I do enjoy, yeah, like flashes of pink and things like that, and with the hippos, they naturally blush, and I find again that's like really capturing a moment within their lives, and they've been really well received, and the addition of small oxpeckers, which those little details they just add a um to the scale in the work as well, which I've really enjoyed making them, and they've been very popular. I mean, I've actually yeah, so they've gone to different parts of the world as well, which is really. I sent a hippo to Melbourne in Australia, um and then the other one went to Northern Ireland, and that can be really exciting, I find, when you're like, oh, I've never been there, and then it's traveled all that way. But um, so
Now,
yeah,
yeah, now a piece of you is there.
yeah, yeah. And I was like with Canada, I've actually sent work to Courtney Island before,
Ah,
um,
yes.
the lady who runs the bear sanctuary there, and I've kind of got an open invitation to go out that way. So. Yeah, which I'd love to go out there, definitely. I mean, that is on the agenda for me. I have a lot of people who often ask me about, have you seen these animals in the wild? And I have seen some, but like you've pointed out, I do look at animals from all over the world. Um, so, and then, yeah, so that's on the agenda to kind of go out and just explore wildlife in its natural habitat. Um, my brother's recently moved to Singapore, actually, so Malaysia's not near, far from there.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Lots of wildlife there. Um, so you use, if we just jump back for a moment to the methods that you're using, Jack, you talk about using slips and some oxides. How do you get all your colors? Do you use any underglazes or
Um,
overglazes with your work?
yes, I do sometimes use underglaze, and I actually sometimes mix them in with slips.
Yeah, yeah.
I find sometimes they can be slightly lack a bit of depth for me, like they can be a bit just a singular color, which can play its strengths in some ways, some things, but generally it's more about for me to just make the colors up with straight up like white slip and then color it from there. And yeah, and I do use glaze as well. So on some work, I've used volcanic glaze and clear glazes and things to, and that's where I would effectively like I kind of plan where light lusters are going to go from that point
Hmm.
forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the majority of your pieces are not glazed, right? You're using like a slip. finish to them. Did
Yeah.
I get that right?
Or yeah, and matte glazing really. Like so, obviously that can be a misunderstanding. I find sometimes that all glaze has to be shiny. Yeah,
Hmm. Hmm.
it's such a variation. Um, and but no, I do. So I don't do full coverage, no, of any glaze really, no. So I use them more like a in a painterly fashion, and I do. Yeah, I've got loads of like I use like hake brushes and things like that uh, to apply generally a lot of my materials, yeah,
Yeah.
onto my work.
Yeah, your recent rabbit head that you've got, I think it's up on your website where you've allowed the natural clay to come forward with what looks like to me some small little splashes of white slip and then some gold luster in the ears. Really, I think is a beautiful piece that in a way references all these techniques that we're talking about.
Yeah, but that those hairs actually, yeah, and that I actually had to refire those. So they were stoneware fired, and the slip that I had applied came out darker than I wanted, um, and because it went straight up to stoneware. So I did refire them actually and apply it more. So um, and then it had that more orange hue coming through, that sort of brick sort of color. But yeah, so that I think when you're working with these materials and the clay bodies, they can vary. So like they're created in a red stoneware, which sometimes it comes out a redder color, and sometimes it's a bit browner than you would want it to be. But um, yeah, so I do find again that layering, and then not necessarily. I mean, there's ways of correcting work for me, that I can be like, okay, I'll do this and then sort it out, and it did for those, which it just added a lot more vibrancy and depth. Um, so yeah, sometimes I find with people you just buy a singular glaze. Like some of the student I do when I teach people, I'm always like, just please test. you know,
Yeah, yes,
and
many,
then
many times, yes.
yeah,
Yeah,
just,
yeah.
and just make scraps from the clay body you've worked with, and then you can just inform your work from there and then you won't be disappointed, for instance.
Mhm. And I think what you've also talked about is keeping a diary of those tests, right? If you're going to test, mark it down, write it down, even, and I love your idea of taking photographs and adding that to your diary because I think that really allows lots of information to be recalled later on.
Yeah, I mean, so I've been out of uni for 10 years, and even like I've still got documentation of things that I did back then. And I keep little tests in boxes and things, and um yeah, and then inevitably there are certain points where you're like, oh, I can't quite recall how this works with that, and then you just have that reference point. But equally, being organic and just having that intuition is fun as well,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it doesn't always play in your favor. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. Hey, can you tell our audience a challenge that you had, something that you encountered that was, I don't know, a problem that you might have had, or a challenge of some sort, and how you overcame that?
Yeah, so I didn't used to use armatures so often with my work, and I found particularly when I started teaching like weekend courses, I that you have to speed the making process, as it were, up. So I so I started to use like newspaper with like I normally put like a singular piece of bubble wrap, if it's a freestanding piece, for instance, right? And then it then gets put onto a mount, and then I'll create like a more solid piece of clay to just help support it if it has fallen like legs. Um, and then it was a case of like, well, how do I remove that later on? And then um, I started using upholstery foam and then flipping them over. It's no it's there's always timings, it's knowing when to do these things. And I did actually, someone said to me once, they were like, "Oh, it's like performing surgery," you know, and then you feel it back up. And then, but I have to do that here because I mean, it's good practice anyway. Obviously, you shouldn't be burning plastic. And, but I share my workshop. So upstairs, I've got jewelers, and obviously, like the fumes from that would not be,
Mm-hmm.
no, no,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's an interesting challenge. Now tell us, and this is really my last question for you, Jack, is there some advice that you might have for another sculptor or potter? What comes to mind for you of how people could improve their skills at this crazy world of ceramics?
Well, I've bleated on a bit about it with testing, but I think also just finding what you enjoy, and it's such a varied material, and and approaches of how you can use that to create something. Um, and it's just for me like it's retaining that the fun element for you as well. And if something's not working, you can always like just scrap it and come, start again. Like it's not been unheard of where I've done that with my own work, and um, it does take time to develop that kind of skill, and but also having just the confidence I find sometimes to do things, particularly with sculpting and the way that I do it. If you're not happy with it, it's about correcting it, and not just settling on like, oh, okay, I can't quite get that right. So, I mean, people say, oh, you seem quite, yeah, confident, brave sometimes, and I'll literally just like get a knife and cut into it, and then, and then reshape the face or something like that, not be allowing it to keep um caving in, for instance. And it's just, as I do talk about it, like about it's for me like retaining a control of what you're doing with sculpting. But for me as well, I did throw a bit when I was at uni, and I do have a pottery wheel, and it's still in a box. And when I get some time, I'm going to have a go at it, because I think it'll be real fun, and I'm looking forward to that. So,
It is true that needs to be a driver of all our work, and that is the enjoyment that we have with it. And if you're not enjoying it, then there's something wrong with the piece or the process, or and that's a good time to stop and potentially even start again.
yes, no, very much so.
Yeah.
And, it's just if you're like new to it, for instance, yeah, try out all sorts of things, and then it's a case of homing in on what you actually and I guess enjoy,
Hmm.
and that just will naturally come about, I think, over time,
Yeah,
really.
absolutely. Your work around animals and birds and so on has naturally emerged out of your love for animals, right? And so what you're talking about makes perfect sense.
And like with Dungeness again, it's such a highly textural place, and I do always, yeah, I like to know that and to have identified that has inspired my uh kind of decorative kind of direction, I think, with my work quite often. It's full of lots of things that are just rotting away, really affected by the elements and things like that. So
Yeah,
yeah.
perfect. Jack, thanks so much for spending time with us today. I really appreciate it. I'm sure people will find lots of your ideas very insightful, and I can see many ceramic artists scurrying back to try some of the things that you talked about. So thank you so much. It was wonderful to have you.
Oh, thank you for having me. Yeah. And yeah, just always I would say, just explore and have fun. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
Thanks for listening to the Color and Ceramics podcast with Bob Acton and his guests. Please help others find the podcast by subscribing to this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, such as iTunes, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, or other podcatchers. And don't forget to give us a review. We'll see you next time.